on to collecting data. So we've got our indicators, we've got our targets, we've thought about validation, we've thought about integrating some qualitative data into how we're analyzing progress. And now we've got to go out and get the data. So we're going to start with quantitative data collection. Some common examples are official records. So anytime that you can collect data without actually having to create a new form or go out and do the research on your own, all the better. This is especially helpful, say, at the output level, you know, attendance records, those kinds of things are perfectly acceptable to use as your data collection tool. Could be school records, usage reports, things that are already being generated that you can check and then use to against your own data, your own indicators. Surveys, questionnaires, these are very common and relatively easy to produce and implement. Closed question interviews, right? So quantitative interviews and talking to people isn't just about qualitative. It could be used for your quantitative data as well. When I say closed question, it's usually sort of a yes or no, or you're asking a series of very specific questions that you're looking for specific answers around, as opposed to asking people, you know, tell me a story about your experience. Controlled observation as well, where you maybe are observing what people are doing or how they're interacting or how they're behaving, or visiting a farm and looking to see evidence that agroecology techniques are being used, and you would check the box to say, yes, I observed that. Sort of those kinds of tools. What other kind of quantitative data collection methods have you all had experience using or found effective when you're doing data collection for your work? Anyone want to share on that?
I've used FGDs, that is focus group discussions, in-depth surveys, in asking and even open-ended questionnaires, in collecting qualitative data.
Okay. Anybody involved in projects that are, I don't know, more scientific in nature, where you might be actually, you know, collecting data that's not about people, but about, I don't know, water quality or other kinds of things?
I'm not sure, but I was involved in an education project. We were actually collecting data based on the quality of primary education in government schools.
Cool.
So we actually consulted old records as well, and then we collected, we made our own questionnaire, closed question interviews for students that helped us to understand the quality of education.
Great. Thanks, Sandeep. Mark?
Can I go back to Sarah's comment about focus groups? They can be very useful. One of my past bosses actually developed the focus group. It was discovered that in groups of people, sometimes people say what they think other people want them to say. So you can get false answers. So it has to be well organized and well thought out focus group to be effective. But I like focus groups.
That's an interesting point, Mark, because I think, you know, when I'm talking about validation, I have a tendency to think of the qualitative piece like a focus group helping to validate your quantitative data findings. But in fact, you probably want to look at it the other way as well, right? So if you're in a focus group setting, keeping in mind the risks of focus groups, you'd want to have another piece of data that would help validate what you're hearing in the focus group setting, perhaps. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. What about experiential kind of survey or assessment, whereby you you try out you try out a project, or you try out something, a product or a service, and then after that you give feedback. Will that fall under qualitative, or that will fall under quantitative?
I
I
think it would
think
depend on how it's structured and how the indicator is structured, because I think that could probably be harnessed for both.
are you talking about like doing a benchmark study or a feasibility study, which would give you comparison data for other data you get later on?
No, I'm talking about maybe it's a new product that is coming in the market, and you want maybe for people to experience, and then
So,
they give their feedback based
yeah,
on what their senses and things like that.
yeah. So that's a feasibility study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, Sarah, I just off the top of my mind here, I think that could be used as a tool, but it could be used as a tool to support quantitative data, or it could be used as a tool that's more qualitative to understand a different piece of quantitative data. And I'll give you an example. So say that you're talking about a product in the market. You may have sales records that show the uptake of that product and how much that product is being purchased in the market. You may then use this experiential survey or whatever, where you're getting feedback on people's experiences with that product to understand why sales levels are the way they are. So I think that could be like a qualitative understanding validation piece to your sales data, which is your quantitative data. But you may also have a quantitative indicator. So an indicator that is broken down into a statistic with numbers that says, percentage total people surveyed responding positively to, or whatever. You could have something that you're asking them to respond to that you're going to then quantify to show what percentage of people responded that the product was useful or good quality or whatever. So it depends on the indicator you're using.
Okay, thank you.
Kate?
Yeah, so one other thing that's come up for me, not in projects quite like this, but it would apply, is in receiving feedback from the participants, requesting assistance. So if you're trying to implement something and what you find is that a lot of people have follow-up questions who need more assistance in the step-by-steps of it, then that can be another indicator of how successful or how well understood it is to begin with.
That's really interesting. I like that, Kate. So could that, let's apply that to this little case study that we're looking at with farmers being trained.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be a way of sort of adding value to, say, like a post-training evaluation, where you're sort of looking at how much did they retain, how much knowledge or skills did they retain based on the training, but you could add sort of a section that says, what are your questions at this point? So you get a sense of what they know, but then that qualitative piece of what are they still wondering about or unsure of, or
yeah. And then if you find that a lot of them have the same question, then the next time round you make sure to include that the first time.
I like that.
I just wanted to chip in something with qualitative data. I remember when we were implementing projects on an early warning system, as agroecological stations placed in communities, rivers or basins. Then at the local level, some observers were appointed to do the reading, but at the same time, in each community, we had a kind of local committee for disaster risk reduction that they will do observation, and at the institution level, we had a kind of data management center. That means the reading observer are compared with the observation of the local, which was made of women. and then they use as for confirmation, the validation of info to validate the observer said, which has been read from the stations, and what have been received at the data management center. Those quality of data. Thank you.
Yeah, I just briefly mentioned sampling, and it's a huge topic, but I think basic questions that need to be asked are just who is participating and how are they selected and who's being represented amongst the people, especially in, I mean, it's important for qualitative as well, but it's particularly important for quantitative simply because the bias, people have a bad tendency to assume that quantitative data is objective, and it's not at all. And it's very important to be very aware of how and why you've selected people. There's a lot of techniques, but that's a whole other conversation, I think.
Yeah, Dave, you're absolutely right. I had some chemical testing for pollution done in China by the Chinese CDC, and they really were not allowed to report the stuff I was looking for. So I was told everything was fine.
I did want to speak just quickly about a couple of the qualitative data collection. You've mentioned focus groups, you've mentioned interviews. I did want to bring back to this for 1 second, just to make a suggestion of something that I find really helpful. And I have a bias towards using something called rolling profile interviews, which are qualitative and they are open-ended interviews or key informant interviews. But I use them in almost every monitoring and evaluation and learning plan that I develop with clients and with CAP Network partners as well. It's essentially a key informant interview that's very open-ended, but where you go back to the same people at various touch points over the course of the project. So you say select a small sample that's a representative sample of the beneficiaries you're trying to reach. If you're working with 100 people, you may choose 6 of those 100, for example. So it's a small sample pool. But what you do is you interview those people with very open-ended questions at, say, the beginning of the project. It could be quarterly, it could be just it could be semi-annual, it could be annually, depending on the length of the project. You go back and you ask them those same open-ended questions about their lives at those various touch points in the project, and let them tell you their story. I find that it provides just a level of just understanding of the human experience of your project and of that particular place and time that is really invaluable and adds such a richness to discussions and analysis of project impact. It also, of course, if you're working in a small NGO, which I think like most of us are, it gives you that double impact of providing value for learning and project monitoring, but it also gives you tremendous content to use in your communications, your storytelling, your reporting back to stakeholders and funders, and your donor audiences that is just tremendous. Because it allows all the project stakeholders to follow the story of the project through the lens of the people who are living and experiencing the project from start to finish. So I just wanted to put that out there. If you've never heard of that before, I highly recommend it. I have some stuff that I can ask Katie to share out with the group about how that works in practice as well. So based on these, our thinking and discussion.
Christy had a question about that, about the rolling profiles.
Sure, Christy.
I was just saying it's super interesting, and I was curious as to what kind of ethical considerations there would be for doing this with children and youth.
Well, definitely, you do need to have a policy about that. Make sure that you're, regardless of the age, whether it's children or adults, you're going to want to make sure that you're very open and you get support and permission from these individuals to share their story. So it's going to have to be people who are willing to share their experience and provide that consent. I always think it's a best practice to have that consent piece to be official, so it's explained, but it's also documented. In the case of adults, signed off on, for example, that this person is giving you their permission. Guardians of children and children themselves, I think, should be asked to provide that consent. I don't think the guardians should be able to provide it solely on behalf of children, that children should need to be comfortable with having their stories shared as well. And that whatever tool you use, and we do have a CAP network, sort of a standard one that you could use as a starting point if you'd like, that consent can be withdrawn at any point. So somebody might start out feeling comfortable. Once they see themselves, coming out in a report or as a case study or a blog post or whatever, they may choose to ask for that to be taken down, or that they're not comfortable with it. I think wherever possible as well, it's a good practice to share the story, anything that's going to be public facing, that gets shared back with the individuals that are participating in the storytelling piece. So they have an opportunity to affirm that what has been the narrative that's been drafted accurately reflects their experience and what they are comfortable having public facing. So again, being as open and participatory through that process as you possibly can, I think is good practice. Even things like, I have sending photographs or printing out a copy of a blog post, and the next time you're out in that community, giving them a copy to say, here you are, and it's been so well received, and people are loving hearing your perspective and being able to follow your journey. But then recognizing that they should also have a copy and be able to access that, even if they're not able to access it online and that.
One thing I might add to that, Christy, is that something I found mostly in Kenya, actually, when I was there in 2018, photographing kids. There were a couple of instances when they had consented to have their photographs taken. Their parents or guardians had consented as well. They were eager to participate at first, and then as I started taking more photographs, it became more and more clear that some of them were not comfortable with it at all. So just being ready to respond to that feedback in the moment is another pretty important piece, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Kate. And Stella, did you have a question? You had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to share an experience in line with what we're talking about, the rolling profile idea. We had a stakeholders dialogue meeting in one of the communities where we worked. There was this unrest that amounted to bloodshed among the youth. So we had to sample opinions of the stakeholders to enable us figure out how we can help solve those issues that were causing the problems. And we came with the media reporters. But before we actually started, we had to seek the consent of these people, because amongst them we had the security officials, we had the main agitators, that's the youth. We also had the militants, if you're conversant with those group of people in Nigeria. And so we had to ask for their consent. Are you okay with this thing going, being aired over the news? Mm-hmm. They said yes at inception. But midway through the program, we discovered that some of them were actually hiding their faces. Some were trying to use their nose mask to cover not just their nose and their mouth this time, but a greater portion of their faces and all that. So at that point, we were sensitive enough to know that they weren't comfortable with the cameras anymore. And so we had to come up again and seek their consent. And at that time, they were like, no, we need this off record. And we had to oblige. So it's always very, very important that we be very, very observant. The consent can be given, and maybe it can also be withdrawn. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that that experience. That's really important consideration. Yeah. We all get to change our minds. All right. Does anybody have anybody want to weigh in on which kinds of data collection tools you would use against this indicator?
I think I'll go for a quantitative, and in this case, it will be more of an in-depth kind of an interview, because
Huh?
it's not just knowing the number of farmers, but also
Becky, dog.
Okay. So you
yeah,
go for an interview so that you would find out the monthly income, but also the other information around their livelihoods and their overall.
their lifestyle change. Yeah, the changing lifestyle. Yes.
Great. Now, can I ask a question, Sarah, as a follow-up? When you say interviews, would you say in this example, we are training 100 farmers. So would you be interviewing, doing one-on-one interviews with all 100 farmers?
No, I would select either randomly or wherever, but then I'll also do not just interview, but case studies, like in-depth interview.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Dave, what do you think?
I was actually just typing.
Okay.
Well, the point that you have here, though, is that there's an improved of at least a certain percent, which means you have to know their baseline income. So you would have need to have collected their income from the participants at the beginning of the program. Mm-hmm. So however you documented their income, you would use the same way to measure or document the income again, and then you would measure the two against one another. Mm-hmm. So that could be done with monitoring. You could have a regular way where participants continue to report their income, or you could do surveys. There are other mechanisms as well, but anytime you're trying to measure change, you actually have to have something to measure against. So that means you need to have their income first, and then you need to measure it later and see if the change happened.
Yep, excellent point.
I was going to say it is possible, although much, much less reliable, to ask retrospective. So you can say, what was your income and what is your income? But that's less reliable, but it's possible.
It's possible, but we'll never have to do that because we'll all always have really good M&E plans at the outset, right? So we won't have to retroactively go back and collect data.
If there's such a thing as tax returns, that could be a reliable past record. But that's not going to be happening in most places in the world.
True. It's very true. Dave mentioned briefly, he touched on there are surveys and then there are other means of collecting this data. And that's an important point, depending on where you're working, anywhere you're working that has mobile coverage, where people are using mobile phones en masse, that opens up lots of opportunities for doing regular monitoring and check-ins with project stakeholders using mobile data collection. And there's a lot of cool tools, including of some free options for how you can collect data using mobile technology in all sorts of different settings, which we can talk about.
Yeah, just to add on, that way we have the importance of local stakeholders in this mechanism that talked about last time. When level, for example, community level, you have NGOs or organizations, community-based organizations involved in this kind of initiative at local level. Each of them have that responsibility of monitoring what is happening. And you might have other organizations specialized in monitoring data, visiting farmland is based on a specific tool where they can collect data and information, even at a monthly basis or at a quarterly basis, on what the production has been, the productivity, if the income has increased or not. When we have situation where the baseline studies has not been done at the beginning of the project, but other stakeholders, based on the responsibility of the work at level, can help as well to achieve that target. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah, I think I can also contribute. I hope you hear me.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I concur with Dave that we need to have a basic at the beginning so that you know what will be increasing, what will be improving. But I think the combination of both qualitative and quantitative, because we have the number here now, will make the best way of collecting the data. So I think that's the thing that I need to I think both qualitative and quantitative. You may do, as you say, like survey, but as you said, this day you can do like a mobile data solution. You just send a quick questionnaires through their mobile phone, and then you get the feedback. So all the numbers, if you want, so long as they have a mobile phone, a smartphone, all the farmers, and then you get the feedback immediately, and then you know the improvements between at the beginning and where we are now. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.